lines, ellipses, and boxes, and we're finally at boxes. So, regarding perspective, before we get into this, I want to make one thing very clear. The lesson content on this page is a lot to take in. The video may help you understand better, but it's not all going to sink in at once. Watch the video, then read through the written material. Then, even if you're unsure of things, move on to the exercises. As you work at it and employ the concepts described, it will gradually start to make more sense over time. Finally, having slogged through lines and ellipses, we've reached the namesake of this website, boxes. I chose that as our name not because it is all I wish to teach you, but because it is representative of so much more. A box consists of 3 sets of parallel lines. If you're familiar with three-dimensional geometry, each set defines an axis, either X, Y, or Z, and in doing so, it establishes the foundation of what we understand to be 3D space. Any object can be simplified into the box that encompasses it. Any form can be represented and constructed within, you guessed it, a box. And any box can be subdivided, carved, and built upon to create any complex object. But if we want to learn how to draw a box, first we need to learn something about perspective. Vanishing points and parallel lines. If you've heard anything about perspective in the past, you've probably heard about the concept of a vanishing point. It is a representation of the most fundamental rule of perspective. As an object moves farther and farther away from you, it is going to appear smaller and smaller to you. Eventually, it'll get so small that it collapses to a single point, after which it effectively vanishes due to being so infinitesimally tiny. A vanishing point. There we go. So we got this picture. So this is a box shape and it's 1 meter. And you can see how over a distance it shrinks into the vanishing point. So that's what he was talking about. Okay, next part. Instead of an object, we can also think of this applying to a distance represented by a single line. As this line moves further and further away, its length, the distance between the end points of the line, would shrink until it too collapsed to a vanishing point. Finally, if you think of this distance as being the distance between any 2 parallel lines, which remains consistent in 3D space by nature of them being parallel, when drawn in 2D, any lines that are parallel to one another will ultimately converge towards, you guessed it, a vanishing point. This brings us to the rule that exists at the core of understanding perspective. Any set of lines that are parallel to one another in 3D space will, as they grow farther and farther away from the viewer, ultimately converge to a single shared point. So, 1, 2, and 3 point perspective. Again, if you don't know anything about perspective already, if you know anything, if we know anything, and even if we don't know anything, why are we here? I messed that up. It's fine. I'll just read it again. If you know anything about perspective already, you'll probably have heard about 1, 2, and 3 vanishing point perspective systems. While we deal with these each in small amounts at first, I want to make one thing clear. Ooh. These 1, 2, and 3 point perspective systems do not exist. It's a simplification of the concept intended to help beginners learn, but one that I find to be extremely limiting. When I was first learning perspective, it was something that confused me for years, and I've seen the same in many of my own students. So I'm gonna read this and then we'll go through the picture, I think. Vanishing points in a scene. A scene will be governed by any number of vanishing points. It simply depends on how many sets of parallel lines you have. If you throw a box into your empty scene, that gives you 3 sets of parallel lines. If you duplicate this box and move it slightly to the side, so it's still sitting parallel to the original, you still only have 3 sets of parallel lines between them, and therefore 3 vanishing points. If, however, you take that second box and rotate it on one of its axes, 2 of its sets of lines will no longer be parallel to the corresponding ones in the other box, and you'll end up with 5 sets, therefore 5 vanishing points. If you think about drawing a scene in your kitchen in perspective, you're going to have all kinds of objects laying about. Fridge, microwave, cutting block, and oven, things that he never uses. And while you may be super neat and obsessive about keeping everything perfectly aligned to a grid, you're not perfect. Some of those things are going to be off at some kind of angle. In fact, if everything were perfectly aligned, it'd feel off, too sterile, not to mention the fact that everything is just a simple box. There are so many different sets of parallel lines in a scene and a vanishing point for all of them. Alright, let's look at this picture. So, in this first image right here, we have this box has 3 sets of parallel lines and therefore 3 vanishing points. And you can see where they all are. And then in the second image, we've duplicated the box and maintained the same vanishing points. So all we've done is slide it along the same parallels. I think that's right. So it still has all the same vanishing points. Now, if we take the box, the new box, and rotate the box, the horizontal vanishing points slide along the horizon, but the vertical one is staying the same. But we end up with 2 new vanishing points, which is what he was talking about before. You take the object, you move it into a different area in space. It's got new vanishing points. Okay. So, okay. Vanishing points at infinity. Now, 3-point perspective would be fine if all we had was a single perfect box in a scene alone. But what about 1 and 2-point perspective? Those are also used to draw similar setups, a perfect cube alone in a scene. But we know that our box is made up of 3 sets of parallel lines, so how can we have fewer than 3 vanishing points? There are ways, based on how we look at a given object, that we can eliminate some of its vanishing points, or perhaps a better way to put it is, those vanishing points are placed so far outside of our canvas or page that the convergence of all the parallel lines leading to it is negligible. It's effectively at infinity, and while in theory, if we can look infinitely far away from where we're actually drawing, we'd be able to see those lines converge. 2-point perspective generally involves the vanishing point of your vertical lines, which usually sits very high up, generally off the page or canvas, being moved so high up that the convergences become pointless. Anywhere within the frame of your composition, any lines going up to that vanishing point will effectively run straight up and down, perpendicular to the horizon. We can achieve this effect only when we are not looking at the box from too high or too low of an angle. 1-point perspective goes one step further. In 2-point, the vertical vanishing point is at infinity, leaving the remaining 2 vanishing points on the horizon line. To move into 1-point perspective, we move one of those vanishing points so far off the side that it too goes to infinity. Your one remaining vanishing point in this scenario is going to be sitting somewhere visible within your composition, rather than being off the page or frame. Otherwise, things are going to look really weird and distorted. This means that the viewer is going to be looking down the barrel of your box, or at least close to it. Okay, now we gotta go look at this picture. So, we have in this first box in the upper left, the vanishing point is in frame, and then as we progress to the right, the vanishing point leaves the frame. So as the vanishing point moves further out of the frame, the rate of convergence diminishes. And here we have 3 boxes. The vertical vanishing point goes to infinity, resulting in 2-point perspective. All vertical lines run perpendicular to the horizon line. And you can see that the 2 vanishing points that remain. And in this image, vertical and one of the horizontal vanishing points have gone to infinity, and the remaining vanishing point slides towards the center, resulting in a 1-point perspective. So the green lines are all verticals running perpendicular to the horizon, and then the blue is horizontal lines run parallel to the horizon. All right. Did anybody understand any of that? Because I don't. But it's fine. We'll learn as we go through the homework. So 1, 2, 3-point perspective simplified. Now, all of this is probably really confusing and is going to take a while to sink in. Don't worry about that. You'll start to grasp it gradually. What you can keep in mind for now, in terms of when to use 1, 2, or 3 vanishing points for a box, are these much simpler rules of thumb. If your view is aligned mostly to a box's face, use 1-point perspective. If your view is aligned mostly to a box's edge, use 2-point perspective. If your view is aligned mostly to a box's corner, use 3-point perspective. This actually works pretty well until you're able to grasp the more complex reasons behind it all. When you're looking directly at a face of a box, one set of its parallel lines are going to be receding to a vanishing point in the frame, somewhere pretty close to the face you're aligned to. When you're looking directly at an edge, you've got 2 sets of parallel lines going off to either side of it. When you're looking at a corner, all 3 sets of parallel lines are coming off of that single point towards their own vanishing points.